December 23rd, 1783. The American Revolution was over. After 8 long years of war, the world's most powerful empire had been defeated by a collection of determined colonies that many believed would never survive. The streets of America echoed with celebration, church bells rang across the young nation, and one man's name was spoken with admiration from New England to Georgia. That man was George Washington. At that moment, no American held greater influence. He commanded the loyalty of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers. He was respected by politicians, admired by ordinary citizens, and feared by foreign governments. If anyone possessed the power to shape the future of the United States according to his own wishes, it was Washington. History had seen this story before. Victorious generals rarely returned quietly to private life. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and transformed Rome forever. Oliver Cromwell defeated a king only to rule England himself. Across history, military triumph often led to absolute power. Many believed America would follow the same path. Would George Washington become another ruler who exchanged liberty for authority? Or would he choose a different road, one that no nation had successfully taken before? The answer would define not only his legacy, but the future of democracy itself. Chapter 1. A Reluctant Leader. Long before he became America's first president, George Washington was known as a Virginia planter surveyor and veteran of the French and Indian War. Standing well over 6 feet tall, he possessed a commanding presence that impressed nearly everyone who met him. Yet those closest to him often described a man who spoke carefully, controlled his emotions, and believed that personal honor mattered more than personal ambition. When the Continental Congress appointed Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in June 1775, the decision was far from obvious. The colonies lacked money, weapons, professional soldiers, and even confidence that they could defeat the British Empire. Washington himself understood the enormous burden before him. According to his own writings, he accepted the position with humility, admitting that he did not believe himself equal to the task. Still, he accepted because he believed duty demanded it. That sense of duty would become the defining characteristic of his life. For the next 8 years, Washington led an army through unimaginable hardship. His soldiers endured freezing winter shortages of food and clothing disease, and repeated military setbacks. At Valley Forge, during the brutal winter of 1777 to 1778, thousands suffered from hunger and exposure. Some marched barefoot through snow stained with blood. Yet the army never completely collapsed. Washington understood that victory would require more than battlefield success. It required perseverance. He inspired loyalty not through fear, but by sharing the hardships of his men and refusing to abandon them when defeat seemed almost certain. Everything changed in October 1781 at Yorktown. British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army after a decisive siege supported by French forces. Although smaller conflicts continued, the surrender effectively ended the Revolutionary War. Against overwhelming odds, the colonies had won their independence. George Washington emerged from the conflict as the unquestioned hero of the new nation. But military victory created an unexpected problem. For the first time in American history, one individual possessed extraordinary prestige, the loyalty of an experienced army and the trust of an entire people. In many countries, this combination had marked the beginning of a monarchy or dictatorship. The United States had escaped the rule of one king. Now many quietly wondered whether another might soon take his place. And as Washington celebrated the triumph of independence, a crisis was already beginning to unfold behind the scenes, one that threatened to destroy the fragile republic before it had truly begun. Part 2. A nation on the edge. Victory had brought independence, but it had not brought stability. When the fighting finally subsided, the United States faced a crisis unlike anything its leaders had imagined. The Revolutionary War had exhausted the nation's resources. Congress was deeply in debt, the Articles of Confederation had left the central government weak, and there was no reliable system to collect taxes. The government had made promises to the soldiers who fought for independence, but it had little money to fulfill them. For thousands of officers and enlisted men in the Continental Army, victory felt strangely hollow. Many had gone years without receiving full pay. Others had accepted certificates that were nearly worthless because the government lacked the funds to honor them. Some soldiers returned home to find neglected farms, struggling families, and uncertain futures. They had risked everything for the cause of liberty, yet now wondered whether the country they had helped create would abandon them. Frustration spread through the army. The officers remained loyal to George Washington, but their patience with Congress was wearing thin. Letters circulated through the camps expressing anger over broken promises. Conversations that had once focused on defeating Britain now turned toward another question. Could the new government even survive? Washington understood the danger immediately. He sympathized with his officers. He knew their sacrifices were real, and he repeatedly urged Congress to fulfill its obligations. In letter after letter, he warned political leaders that neglecting the army could have disastrous consequences. But Congress remained divided, powerless, and nearly bankrupt. As weeks passed, rumors grew darker. Some officers began suggesting that peaceful petitions were no longer enough. If Congress refused to act, perhaps the army should force it to listen. Others looked across history and pointed to examples where victorious generals had stepped in to restore order when civilian governments proved ineffective. It was a dangerous line of thinking. The American Revolution had been fought against the concentration of power in the hands of a monarch. If the army now imposed its own will upon Congress, the new republic could collapse before it had even begun. Washington found himself trapped between two loyalties. On one side stood the soldiers who had trusted him through years of hardship. On the other stood the civilian government he had sworn to defend. Supporting the army too strongly could undermine the very principles of the revolution. Ignoring the army's grievances, however, risked losing the confidence of the men who had secured America's independence. Then, in early March 1783, events took an even more alarming turn. An anonymous letter began circulating among officers stationed at Newburgh, New York. It called for a meeting to discuss their growing frustrations and hinted that stronger action might be necessary if Congress continued to ignore them. Although the letter never openly demanded a coup, its meaning was difficult to miss. Some officers were beginning to consider using the army's strength as political leverage. The document quickly spread through the camp. Its author was never officially identified, though historians have long suspected that it may have been written by Major John Armstrong Jr., an aide to General Horatio Gates. Whoever penned it understood the mood of the officers perfectly. The letter appealed to their sense of injustice, their financial hardship, and their disappointment with Congress. The timing could not have been worse. The war was ending. Peace negotiations were underway, and the future of the United States remained uncertain. One reckless decision could undo everything the revolution had achieved. Word of the anonymous meeting reached George Washington almost immediately. He knew this was no ordinary complaint over unpaid wages. This was the greatest test of his leadership. For the first time since taking command of the Continental Army, George Washington faced the possibility that the very army he had led to victory might become the greatest threat to American democracy. What happened next would determine whether the United States remained a republic or became just another nation ruled by military power. Part 3. The Speech That Saved a Republic. The meeting was scheduled for March 11, 1783. Inside the military camp at Newburgh, New York, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had spent years fighting side by side were now preparing to confront a different enemy, not the British Army, but their own government. The anonymous letters had done exactly what their author intended. They transformed private frustration into organized resistance. Many officers believed they had reached the breaking point. They had sacrificed their youth, their fortunes, and for some, their families. Now, with victory finally within reach, Congress seemed ready to forget them. Some began asking a question that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. If Congress refused to honor its promises, why should the Army continue to obey Congress? For any young republic, this was a nightmare scenario. Throughout history, armies that lost faith in civilian leaders had often seized power themselves. Ancient Rome had witnessed generals become dictators. Across Europe, military victories frequently led to monarchies or authoritarian rule. America seemed dangerously close to following the same path. George Washington understood the stakes better than anyone. If the Continental Army turned against Congress, the ideals of the American Revolution would be destroyed by the very men who had fought to defend them. Washington acted immediately. Rather than allowing the unofficial gathering to proceed, he canceled it and called for a formal meeting on March 15th. His decision bought valuable time, but it also created enormous uncertainty. No one knew where their commander truly stood. Would he side with the frustrated officers, or would he defend a government that had failed to pay them? When the day arrived, the meeting hall filled with officers from across the army. Conversations grew quiet as Washington entered the room. His appearance alone commanded respect. For nearly 8 years, these men had followed him through defeats, freezing winters, hunger, disease, and victory. They trusted him more than any politician in Philadelphia. Washington began calmly. He acknowledged their sacrifices. He admitted that Congress had failed them. He assured them that their grievances were real and deserved justice. Had he stopped there, many officers might have expected him to support stronger action against Congress. Instead, his message took an unexpected turn. Washington warned that any attempt to use military force against the civilian government would betray everything they had fought to achieve. The revolution had never been about replacing one form of tyranny with another. America could not claim to defend liberty while allowing its own army to intimidate elected representatives. Then came the moment that would echo through history. As Washington prepared to read a letter from a member of Congress, he reached into his pocket and removed a pair of reading glasses. Many of the officers had never seen him wear them before. He paused briefly before speaking words that have become legendary. "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." The room fell silent. Those simple words carried extraordinary weight. For years, these officers had viewed Washington as an almost heroic figure, strong, disciplined, and seemingly tireless. In that quiet moment, they were reminded that he had made the same sacrifices they had. He had grown older beside them. He had endured the same hardships. He had not asked them to bear any burden that he himself had escaped. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Several officers were visibly moved. According to contemporary accounts, many struggled to hold back tears. Washington finished his address by urging patience, reason, and unwavering commitment to the principles of Republican government. Justice, he insisted, must come through lawful means, not through threats of military power. His words accomplished what no order or command ever could. The anger that had fueled the conspiracy began to dissolve. The officers abandoned any serious thought of using the army against Congress. The crisis that had threatened to destroy the young republic quietly came to an end. Without firing a single shot, George Washington had defeated perhaps the most dangerous threat America had faced since declaring independence. Yet an even greater test of his character still lay ahead. The world had watched victorious generals seize power countless times before. Now everyone wondered what Washington himself would do with the immense authority he still possessed. Part 4. Walking away from power. The Newburgh Crisis was over. The Continental Army had stepped back from the brink and the fragile American Republic had survived its first great internal threat. Yet George Washington still faced a decision that would define not only his own legacy, but the future of the United States. He remained the most admired man in America. His officers trusted him without question. Ordinary citizens viewed him as the hero who had delivered independence. Even many political leaders believed no one else possessed the authority to unite the young nation. If Washington had chosen to keep command of the army or even demand greater political power, few people could have stopped him. History suggested that this was exactly what successful military leaders did. Alexander the Great never surrendered his conquests. Julius Caesar's victories led him to become dictator of Rome. Napoleon Bonaparte would later crown himself Emperor of France after rising through military success. Power once gained was rarely surrendered voluntarily. The world expected George Washington to follow the same path. Instead, he did something almost unimaginable. On December 23, 1783, Washington traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, where the Continental Congress was meeting. The occasion was formal, but its significance reached far beyond the walls of the State House. Members of Congress gathered quietly as Washington entered the chamber. He wore his military uniform for what would be one of the final times in public. The commander who had led the revolution stood before the civilian government he had served for more than 8 years. Then he spoke. In a calm and dignified address, Washington expressed gratitude to the officers and soldiers who had fought beside him. He thanked Congress for its confidence and reflected on the extraordinary struggle that had secured American independence. Finally, he announced that he was resigning his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. With those words, he voluntarily surrendered the greatest military authority in the United States. There was no pressure forcing him to resign. No election had removed him. No rival army stood ready to replace him. The decision was entirely his own. When he finished speaking, Washington handed his commission back to Congress, bowed respectfully, and quietly left the chamber. The symbolism was extraordinary. For centuries, nations had witnessed victorious generals transform military success into personal rule. Washington had demonstrated something entirely different, that military power should always remain subordinate to civilian authority. News of his resignation quickly spread across Europe. Many found it difficult to believe. Among those who heard the reports was King George III, the very monarch Washington had fought against during the Revolution. According to later accounts recorded by the American painter Benjamin West, when the king learned that Washington intended to return to private life rather than retain power, he reportedly remarked, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Whether every word of that famous quotation is exact has been debated by historians, but the sentiment reflects how astonishing Washington's decision appeared to the world. After years of war, he returned not to a palace but to Mount Vernon. He resumed the life of a farmer and landowner, hoping that his public service had come to an end. For a brief moment, it seemed that George Washington had achieved what he wanted most, a quiet retirement. But America was far from stable. The government created under the Articles of Confederation was proving too weak to solve the nation's growing problems. Economic turmoil, disputes between the states, and fears about the future convinced many leaders that the revolution had won independence but had not yet secured a functioning nation. Before long, the country would once again turn to the one man it trusted above all others. Washington had walked away from power once. Soon, America would ask him to return not as a general but as its first president. Part 5. The Legacy of a Man Who Chose a Republic. George Washington had every reason to believe his public life was over. Back at Mount Vernon, he devoted himself to managing his estate, improving his farms, and spending time with his family. After nearly a decade of war, retirement was not simply a personal wish, it was a reward he had earned. But the nation he helped create was struggling. The government established under the Articles of Confederation lacked the authority to solve many of the country's growing problems. States often acted independently, the national treasury was nearly empty, and political leaders feared that the fragile union could fall apart before it truly began. Many Americans reached the same conclusion. Only one man possessed enough trust, respect, and moral authority to unite the country once again. That man was George Washington. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Although Washington spoke relatively little during the debates, his presence alone gave the convention credibility. His reputation reassured delegates and the public that the effort was intended to strengthen the republic, not replace it with another form of tyranny. 2 years later, after the Constitution was ratified, the Electoral College unanimously chose George Washington as the first president of the United States. No serious rival challenged him. The nation believed there was simply no one else capable of carrying such responsibility. Even then, Washington accepted the office with hesitation. In private letters, he confessed that he approached the presidency with anxiety rather than excitement. Once again, he accepted leadership not because he desired power, but because he believed his country required his service. During his presidency, Washington faced a challenge unlike any military campaign. Every decision established a precedent. There were no traditions to follow, no former presidents to imitate. Every action would help define the office for generations to come. He created the first presidential cabinet, signed legislation establishing the federal judiciary, supported the creation of a national financial system, and sought to keep the young nation out of the growing conflict between Britain and revolutionary France. Most importantly, he reinforced a principle he had demonstrated years earlier, that no individual should place personal ambition above the survival of the republic. After serving 2 terms, many expected Washington to remain in office. His popularity remained unmatched, and nothing in the Constitution prevented him from seeking another term. He almost certainly would have won. Instead, in 1796, he announced that he would retire. His farewell address urged Americans to value national unity, preserve the Constitution, avoid excessive political division, and remain cautious about permanent foreign alliances. While some of his recommendations reflected the realities of the 18th century, his central message was timeless. The strength of a republic depends not on one leader, but on the institutions that outlive every leader. By stepping down voluntarily for a second time, first as commander of the army, and later as president, Washington established one of the most important traditions in American political history, the peaceful transfer of power. That example endured for more than 150 years, before the 2-term limit was formally written into the Constitution through the 22nd Amendment in 1951. George Washington died at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. The nation mourned the loss of its founding leader, yet his greatest achievement was not a military victory, a political office, or even the presidency itself. It was a decision. At a moment when history suggested that power should be seized, he chose to surrender it. At a time when many nations were ruled by kings, emperors, and dictators, he demonstrated that true leadership is measured not by how much power a person acquires, but by how willingly they give it back. George Washington never wore a crown, yet by refusing one, he became something far greater. He became the standard against which every American president would be measured, and the man who proved that the survival of a republic depends not only on great victories, but on the character of those entrusted to lead it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of the Untold History of U.S. Presidents, don't forget to subscribe and join us for episode 2. where we'll uncover the remarkable story of John Adams, the brilliant, stubborn statesman who helped keep America's fragile new republic alive when it seemed destined to fail.